Welcome to the Harold B. Lee Library's House of Learning Lecture Series. I'm Mike Hunter, the coordinator for this year's lecture series. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verse 119, it says, "Organize yourselves and establish a house, even a house of faith, a house of learning." Through this lecture series, the Harold B. Lee Library seeks to establish a house of learning by bringing together students and scholars for discussion of ideas. Today, we are privileged to have as our featured speaker Renata Forste, Professor and Chair, BYU's Department of Sociology. Professor Forste received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 1992 and taught for 3 years at Western Washington University before joining the faculty at BYU in 1995. Previous to her appointment as department chair, she served as an associate dean in the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. Her research focuses on the role of men in family formation, as well as family interaction and child well-being in Latin America and the U.S. Currently, she teaches a general education introduction to sociology course in graduate social statistics. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Forste.
I'd first like to thank Mike and express my appreciation to the Harold B. Lee Library for this opportunity to present at their House of Learning lecture series. I'd like to introduce my topic by sharing some personal experiences about fathering and the examples of fathers in my life. My own father grew up in Utah and then went off to graduate school, and essentially I was the oldest child, and so I had much more of an interaction with him growing up because he was around more while he was a student. But once he graduated from school and began into his career, his primary focus was the good provider role. And my younger siblings have commented over time that their memories of Dad growing up were always that Dad was always working. And my one brother has said that he only got to know our father as an adult. Interestingly enough, my father, once he retired, became much more involved as a father and as a grandfather, excuse me. So he actually takes care of my sister's 2 little girls 3 days a week now because both she and her husband are employed. So he's much more involved as a grandfather than he was as a father. In contrast, my husband, his father also worked an evening shift at Goodyear Tire. My husband's a convert to the church, and he would only see his father briefly before his father would go off to work. And he never had a very strong emotional connection with his father. It wasn't until his father was dying of cancer that was the first time that either one of them ever expressed the words "I love you" verbally to each other. So as we were dating, my husband talked about how he wanted to be much more involved in his children's lives than his father had been in his. And he actually, for 15 years, stayed home full-time with our 3 girls as the Mr. Mom in our relationship as I worked full-time following graduate school. And it was interesting because his dad would call up and he'd always say, "Well, Mike, so when are you going to get a job?" And Mike would say, "Well, Dad, I'm not looking for a job," because his father just couldn't quite understand this relationship that we had and why Mike wasn't actively looking for a job to fulfill the breadwinner role. And even it seems like every time his father would call, that was always the question he'd ask, even though Mike explained that he wasn't looking for a job. But Mike has a very close relationship with our 3 girls, and it's through looking at the lives of these men and how they define their role as fathers that I became interested in this particular area of research. And I wanted to know how men think about and how they bring about changes in their lives to fulfill these different roles, and how they construct across the life course and the meaning that they give then to their role as fathers. In presenting this research, I want first to acknowledge that this was funded by a grant from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And I also want to recognize the contribution of graduate students that have worked with me on this project over the years, David Hawes, John Jarvis, Dallin Flake, and Rebecca Allen Jackson in particular. So to start, this is just a very brief historical outline of some of the changes in fathering roles in the United States. Historical surveys of fatherhood in the U.S. have examined how fathers' roles as teacher and moral guide during the colonial period gave way to the father breadwinner role following the Industrial Revolution. The model of father breadwinner, mother homemaker was particularly dominant in the 1950s, when families in which a sole wage-earning father comprised almost 2/3 of all American households. Starting in the 1970s, men's wages began to decline, in particular as those high-paying manufacturing jobs began to go overseas, and in response, women began to enter the labor force in greater numbers. With no-fault divorce in the 1970s, divorce rates increased, as did non-marital childbearing. Additionally, family relationships and gender roles were questioned and redefined through the feminist movement. These transformations, coupled with other economic and social changes, resulted in the decline of the breadwinner role. With just the decline of the father breadwinner model, new cultural constructs of fatherhood have emerged. One of these emerging models has been the involved father, that is, a father who is emotionally connected with his children and that shares childcare responsibilities with his partner. Given the cultural imperative in favor of paternal involvement, sometimes called the new father ideal, such fathers are often seen as good dads. In sharp contrast, a second emerging model has been the uninvolved father, sometimes seen as the deadbeat dad. These are men that lose contact with their children and are estranged from family life. Based on the new father ideal, these men are commonly viewed as bad dads. Now, there is no single dominant model of fatherhood today. Expectations about fatherhood and the actual practices of fathers have become more varied, and fatherhood is less clearly defined. And you can see this in particular in how fathers have been portrayed in the media and in television over time. So you see back starting in 1954, some of you may be old enough to remember some of these sitcoms, this was Father Knows Best. And this was very much the father breadwinner, mother homemaker role. And you can see father is very much the center of family life. In 1958, we have Leave It to Beaver. Again, very much the same sort of pattern. But then in 1969, we have the Brady Bunch, which is an example of a blended family, although in this case it was a blended family following widowhood. And it presented some of the challenges of bringing families together from two different households. In 1971, there was All in the Family, which was during the time when men's wages were beginning to decline. This was an intergenerational family show that talked about some of the challenges in terms of the threat to the breadwinner role as working opportunities, particularly for blue-collar workers, began to decline. In 1984, we have The Cosby Show. And this was an example of dual career parenting. And Dr. Huxtable was very much the sort of involved and nurturing father who shared both parenting and the breadwinner role with his partner, with his wife. 1989, we have The Simpsons. And a lot of these portrayals are of fathers who maybe fulfill the breadwinner role, but they don't carry the same amount of respect that some of the earlier fathers in the 1950s. They're often sort of portrayed as doofuses or incompetent. And now we have in 2003, 2.5 Men, which shows a divorced father raising his son, living with his brother, and the challenges of parenting and dating. Historically, demographers have studied patterns of family formation, primarily based on surveys of women, because if you want to know accurate information about childbearing, it's best to ask women. So men have generally been underrepresented in national surveys on family, and in particular, young adult men. But in the mid-1990s, demographers began to bring men into the study of family formation, with particular emphasis on married and divorced men. But the literature on young adult men, especially disadvantaged non-marital fathers, was still very much lacking. And this is the group that in particular I have focused my research. So based on a review of past research, this model that you see here sort of illustrates the importance of men in forming sexual unions, making contraceptive decisions related to family formation. The importance of these processes to fathering children, as well as to later paternal involvement, is also highlighted. This conceptual model draws from a life course and structural perspective and examines men's family formation behaviors and early participation in parenting, and this is the model that underlies our research. First, we focused on the formation of sexual unions, or the transition to sexual activity among young men. Using data from a national survey of adolescent males, where they were first surveyed in 1988 when they were 15 to 18 years of age, we looked at factors associated with the transition to sexual activity among young men. And rather than seeing those who were not yet sexually active as a unified group, based on survey questions, we were able to identify two different groups. One we referred to as delayers, who were delaying sexual activity, and the other group we refer to as anticipators. Now in this slide you can see that the most common response that they gave for their sexual experience, among delayers the most common response was a desire to wait until marriage, 32%. The second most given reason was that they wanted to wait until they were older. In contrast, among anticipators, the most common reason for not yet being sexually active was a lack of opportunity to initiate intercourse, 35%. And the second most given reason was a fear of disease or getting a girlfriend pregnant. So as we looked at these two different groups, the delayers and the anticipators, we looked at other types of factors and how they were associated with these two groups of men and how they viewed their opportunities and their motivations in terms of family formation. As you can see in this slide, anticipators are much more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors, such as alcohol, tobacco use, and they were more likely to have been suspended from school or to have been arrested. They are also more likely to engage in precoital behaviors, such as kissing, all the way up to various forms of petting. Anticipators, compared to delayers, were also more approving of premarital sex. In contrast, delayers reported being influenced more by their parents. They had more stricter rules at home and had greater church attendance relative to anticipators. So next, we actually used the next wave of data, which was collected in 1990-91, and so we were able to follow over time these young men to see who was actually likely to initiate sexual activity within the next year. What we found was that there were strong differences between the two groups. Anticipators were significantly more likely than delayers to have first intercourse within 1 year of the survey, 53% versus 13%. Precoital experience increased the likelihood of initiating sexual intercourse for both groups, as did approval of premarital sex. Interestingly enough, parental influence among delayers and strict rules among anticipators actually increased the likelihood of initiating sexual activity. Overall, living with both parents reduced the odds of initiating sex within the next year. Having a mother who gave birth as a teenager dramatically increased the odds for anticipators. They were 14.5 times more likely to initiate sexual activity if their mother had been a teenager when she gave birth. Anticipators' sexual behavior occurs in a high-risk context, whereas delayers may have internalized the decision to delay first intercourse and have background and factors that then encourage the delay. We then followed these young men through to the next wave of the National Survey of Adolescent Males, which was collected in 1995, when they were aged 21 to 27. Then we were able to look at the transition to fatherhood. In particular, we looked at the association between living with their own father during adolescence and early paternity and residency with their own children. You can see here that about 3/4 of the men who were in this survey reported that they lived with their father at age 14, and an additional 7% were living with a stepfather. 25% of the young men had fathered a child by 1995. 17% were fathers and living with their children. A higher percentage of young men not living with a biological or stepfather as a teen reported being a father in 1995, 39%. 22% reported being a father and residing with their children. These bivariate percentages suggest that not living with a father as a teen is associated with early paternity. So next, using multinomial logistics techniques, we found that living with a father during adolescence reduced the odds that young men experience fatherhood at an early age. In addition, living with a biological father as a teen increased the likelihood that if they did father children, they would live with their children. Now, as you can see by the latter part in this model, the effects become non-significant. And that's because once you control for some background characteristics, those relationships then become attenuated. And in particular, including race, because young men, in the literature, those who are African American are less likely to reside with their children than other race and ethnic groups. In addition, the relationship of the father and his effect on early paternity for his son is also attenuated by current education and work status. So fathers influence the education level of their sons, which then influences whether they transition early into parenting. Following our analysis of the National Survey of Adolescent Males, we wanted to look more closely at the decision-making process young men go through as they form families. We were especially interested in low-income, young, single fathers, those who had particularly had children outside of marriage. So we were able to, with the funding that we had, begin a qualitative study. And we advertised through an agency that services low-income children in a western city for fathers who would be interested in participating in our study. 2 graduate students, David Hawes and Dallin Flake, interviewed 37 low-income men that had experienced fatherhood outside of marriage. The average age of these men was 29, and their ages ranged from 20 to 41. Most of the men that we interviewed were actively engaged in parenting at least some of their children. They were either living with a partner or sharing parenting between 2 households. One of the topics that we explored in these interviews was their expectations to marry. Men who had fathered children as teens were less likely to marry or to assume parental responsibilities than those who fathered children at older ages. They also talked about how they lacked confidence sometimes in their own ability or their partner's ability to settle down, to stop partying, and to be faithful. One of the most interesting findings was that the reason they hadn't married was not because they didn't believe in marriage. It wasn't that they didn't think marriage was important, but it was because they didn't want to be divorced. Many of these young men had grown up in divorced families and didn't want their children to go through that type of conflict. One father, sharing parenting of his son with his former partner, put it this way, quote, "I don't want him to see us fighting. I don't want it to get bad or anything like that. That's what I didn't like to see, because I saw my parents fight all the time. I don't want him to see that at all. I just want him to have a good life and be a kid." They also felt that it was easier to end a relationship if things didn't work out with their partner, if they were cohabiting, whereas if they were married, they'd have to go through legal channels to divorce. They preferred to work out parenting arrangements with their partner without getting the courts involved. Another man living with his partner explained it this way, quote, "You know, I've been with her 12 and a half years, and I don't think marriage would change anything other than if we was to separate, there'd be more problem with us. You know, we'd have to go to court, do this, do that, and right now we could just stay separate and not have to go to court to get visitation rights because we don't do that. She lets me see him whenever I want to, and that's fine, but like I say, if we was married, there'd be a lot more problems that could occur through that." Overall, we found that these fathers expected to marry sometime in the future, but because of uncertainties in their current relationships, they chose to cohabit instead. The primary challenges to marriage or long-term commitment that men reported were economic strains due to a lack of educational and occupational opportunities, and parenting stresses due to poor parenting and family interaction skills. One father explained why he and his partner were separated. He said, quote, "I think it was a trust and a communication issue more than it was anything else. She wasn't able to trust me, and a lot of the communication between the both of us was not where it should have been. In any relationship, friendship, whatever, if you don't have trust and communication, I don't think any kind of friendship or relationship will work." In these same interviews, we asked these men about their relationship with their own father, as well as about their experiences fathering their children. And we divided them into two groups based upon these responses. And here you can see an example of their types of responses and how we categorized them. In the first example, when describing his own father, this young man said, quote, "He's always worked like that. He's always stepped up. And that's what I've tried to learn from him. When I would miss work or something, he'd be like, 'Hey man, I don't ever miss work, even if I'm sick. I need to put food on the table, and I want you to realize that one of these times your life is going to be like that.'" So this is an example of a father that we categorize this relationship as being close to his father. In the next example, when asked who his role model was, this young man replied, "I'd say my mom, probably, just because she was always there. My dad would go and drink, and she'd be the one who had to discipline me and talk to me. My mom was the one who helped me out through everything. When I found out I had a kid, it was my mom I turned to." And it was interesting as we asked these young men who their role model was, in particular, who was the best example of a father role model. Those who were close to their fathers always identified their own father. And then sometimes they would maybe mention a coach or a scout leader or someone like that in their life. Those who were not close to their father would often mention that their best example of a father in their life was their mother, or maybe a grandfather or an uncle or a friend. And sometimes they would mention Bill Cosby, that was quite a popular one, or some other sports figure that they turned to as an example to try to learn more about what it meant to be a father. So we looked at the relationship that these men had with their own father, and then we looked at how they were parenting and involved in the lives of their own children. In addition to one's current social circumstances, past family relationships are an important influence on men's definitions of fatherhood. Men are influenced by role models of fathering they have experienced in their own lives. Research shows that men who have had positive relationships with their own fathers are more inclined to have positive parenting skills, and conversely, those that have negative relationships will display negative skills. Research on the intergenerational transmission of both abusive and constructive parenting provides support for this conclusion, and generally supports social learning theory with its focus on the modeling of attitudes, values, emotions, or behaviors. Yet there is also research that underscores men's agency in reconfiguring their role as fathers. If they are exposed to a negative role model of fatherhood when they are young, the majority of men who report this kind of negative childhood experience don't replicate this with their own children. This phenomena of crossing over is when men exhibit positive fathering despite having had negative experiences with their own fathers. And this underscores men's agency or ability to develop their own positive patterns of fathering to replace the lack of caring from their own fathers. Based on this theoretical model, we then expected young men with good fathering role models in their lives to follow those examples. And in contrast, those that had poor fathering models would be likely to compensate for the bad examples of their own fathers. We wanted to know how these men negotiated the demands of fatherhood in light of economic constraints, the absence of marriage, and in some cases, a lack of positive role models. So first we looked at those who had had a close relationship with their father. In these narratives, respondents described what they perceived to be a father's responsibility to his children. Overall, men close to their fathers talked about a father's commitment to his family and the importance of being involved in the lives of children and partners. They talked about how they would negotiate sometimes. It was important to them to be able to have access to their children, and that they would sometimes feel like it was more important to get along with their partner than it was to be right, because they wanted to be active in their children's lives. In addition, the importance of the breadwinner role was the dominant role mentioned. Respondents also talked about the importance of providing emotional support or nurturing children, and they also mentioned the role of moral teacher and disciplinarian. Many of them talked about how they followed the example of their father, in particular, that he was a good provider, that he always got up, he went to work, he took care of them financially. But they would often mention that they wanted to be able to do more than that. That in addition to providing financially, they felt like it was important to have an emotional connection with their children. And they talked about the challenge of doing this. One father said, quote, "Your role is to make as much money as you can while spending the most time with your kids." So they talked about these responsibilities and roles in the context of their relationship with their own fathers. Generally, these men looked to their fathers as a breadwinner role model, but they also recognized this importance of spending time with their children, even at the expense of work. One father said, quote, "My father worked probably closer to 14, 15 hours a day, so we weren't as close as I wanted to be." In contrast, he said he was willing to spend less time in his business in order to have more time for his daughter. He said, quote, "She needs to know who I am. She needs to be a part of my life. Therefore, I'm not able to dedicate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to my job. I try to spend as much time with her as I can. I try to make the time where I can actually take time off work." Commitment to family was also a theme that emerged among respondents not close to their own fathers. However, these fathers were more likely to be involved or living with some of their children, but not all of them. Many more of these men had multiple children with multiple partners. Some of them they were living with, usually it was their current partner if they had a child, but they also had children that they had fathered previously in other relationships, in some cases with whom they had no contact at all. Some had children from previous relationships they were paying child support for, but other than this, they had very little involvement. Contact with children depended largely on their relationship with the child's mother. One father explained, "I love being a father. I raised my son. They say that I have another daughter and I pay child support, but I've never seen her and I don't think she's mine. But the state says she is, so I raise my son. He lives with me." These men talked about being there for their partners and children, but described challenges and problems that made it difficult for them to take responsibility. They often felt that they had been too young when they became a father, and the youngest that we interviewed, he was 14 when his girlfriend became pregnant. And, his comment was, "How could I possibly provide, at 14 years of age?" So he and his girlfriend had made the decision to give the baby up for adoption, and he talked about how that was a very mature thing for him to do, and that he patted himself on the back for making that decision, that he felt like that was important, that the child have the opportunity to have a father in his or her life. The importance of working and providing financially was generally the first role emphasized by these men. This was seen as being there for their children. Some men further defined being there to include attending their children's activities. This was seen as being a more involved father relative to their own fathers. In comparison to the stepfather that raised him, one father said, quote, "In the providing part, I don't rate as well as my father. I think I rate better than him because he didn't spend too much time with my brother and I. He never went to our football games or wrestling matches. I spend time with my son. I go to all of his soccer games." Several fathers also raised concern regarding discipline and the need to not perpetuate the abuse they received as a child. They talked about the struggle to discipline without losing control. One father said, quote, "I am scared of me. I am scared of the cycles. A son will treat his children the way he was treated." Several of them talked about how growing up the rules were different then, that you could spank a child or you could hit a child and you wouldn't get hauled off to jail. And that was one of their motivations to not physically discipline their children, was because they knew that the laws were a lot tighter now. But they also talked about this challenge of how to discipline. It wasn't that it wasn't important to them, but they didn't necessarily know what to do. One father who was abused by foster parents, speaking about the hardest part of being a father, said, "Discipline. I don't know a lot of other ways. I get to the point when I get all mad, and I've learned that it's just best to walk away, because I was abused when I was a kid. All of the men I knew would beat me. That's how I was raised. They whipped me and used a strong fist and all that kind of stuff. I won't do that to my son." These men often talked about a lack of fathering role models and the desire to have better parenting skills. And that was one thing that I was very struck by in reading these interviews. It wasn't that they didn't care, it's just they didn't know what to do. They knew what they didn't want to do. They knew the wrong behaviors because they had seen that in their own fathers, but they didn't necessarily know what to replace it with. One of these young men who was raised in foster care said it this way. He said, quote, "I wish I had someone like a grandpa to go to. I wish I had a father figure that I could get guidance from." So in sum, fathers play an important role in family formation, both their own and in influencing future generations. For their sons, they influence the timing of and transition to sexual activity and fatherhood. They influence the likelihood that their sons will live with their children, and they are particularly important as role models in fathering. Men with close relationships with their fathers define their roles more in terms of emotional support and developing a caring, nurturing relationship with their children. Their descriptions of being there include an emotional element. For example, one father raising his 2-year-old daughter alone said, quote, "I want her to be able to come to me and tell me about her problems. I would like her to feel that she can talk to me no matter what." In contrast, men without close father relationships define their roles more in terms of doing things, going to work, attending activities, as well as not doing things, verbal or physical abuse. As described by another father, a man's role is, quote, "to be financially responsible, to be respectable, to have your bills paid, have your kids in good clothes, food in the house, and time to do other things." But overall, one 26-year-old father explained it best. He said, quote, "I think every child needs their mom and their dad. They need unconditional love by both parents." Thank you.